The morning my father told the board I was only good for smiling at clients, I already had the file that could bury him. He thought blood loyalty meant silence. He thought the daughter he sidelined for years would keep protecting a family name built on lies. But when the boardroom doors closed and the first slide appeared, the room changed, and so did everything we thought we knew about who was really destroying the business. Tell me where you are watching from then, like, subscribe, and stay with me. My father built his reputation on two things: certainty and spectacle. He was the kind of man who entered every room like he had already won the argument before anyone else spoke. He had a voice that carried without effort, a silver tie clip he treated like a crown, and a habit of saying my name in front of people, as if it were a joke he was too polite to fully tell. Savannah has good instincts with people, he would say at investor dinners, smiling into his whiskey glass. But operation strategy. Let us leave that to the people who understand pressure. By people he meant men. Usually he meant my younger brother Grant. Grant had never built anything in his life except excuses. He could walk into a late meeting with no notes, charm 3 department heads, and somehow leave with praise for leadership presence. He had been with Whitmore Industrial for less than 4 years, and already had a senior vice president title. I had been there for nearly a decade, starting in procurement, moving into logistics, then restructuring 2 underperforming divisions without public credit. Every difficult cleanup seemed to arrive on my desk. Every visible reward landed on his. At family dinners, my mother treated this as natural law. "Your brother has your father's instincts," she would say, placing a serving spoon into Grant's hand, like she was passing down a sword. "You have your grandmother's patience. Every family needs both." What that really meant was this: Grant got power and I got endurance. I learned early that if I wanted truth, I would not get it from words. I would get it from numbers, patterns, timing signatures, late invoices, and the tiny tremors people left behind when they thought nobody was looking. Whitmore Industrial manufactured specialty mechanical components for municipal water systems, hospital facilities, and emergency infrastructure. It was not glamorous, but it was profitable, steady, and old enough to carry our family name through 3 states. My grandfather had built the company from a machine shop outside Columbus. My father inherited it and spent 30 years turning his inheritance into a kingdom. Publicly, he was admired. Privately, he ruled on humiliation. He praised people only when they became useful props. He punished questions by delaying promotions, freezing budgets, or whispering to the board that someone lacked temperament. He kept everyone slightly hungry, slightly afraid, and deeply aware that his approval could disappear overnight. Still, until the winter of that board meeting even, I believed the worst thing about him was favoritism. I was wrong. It started with a warehouse discrepancy in Cincinnati. A routine quarterly reconciliation landed in my inbox on a Thursday night. The kind nobody else read carefully because everyone trusted the system. A batch of emergency valve assemblies had been logged as shipped to a municipal subcontractor in Indiana. The invoice was clean. The authorization trail looked normal. The signature belonged to a procurement manager I knew well enough to call if something felt off. Something felt off. The pricing was padded just enough to avoid obvious alarm, and the vendor number was attached to a subcontractor that had only appeared in our records the previous year. When I checked delivery confirmation, the timestamp had a formatting mismatch. Small, easy to miss. The sort of thing that could have been software migration residue or manual interference. I called Dana from procurement the next morning. She answered on the second ring, already tired. "I did not approve that shipment," she said after I read her the order number. I swiveled in my chair and stared at the city through my office window. "Your signature is on it." My old signature stamp, maybe. I stopped using that version last spring. That was the first crack. By lunch, I had found 7 more transactions tied to the same vendor family, each routed through emergency procurement exceptions. By evening, I had a list of 12 payments made across 9 months to shell subcontractors with vague names and nearly identical billing structures. They were all small enough individually to hide in volume. Together, they were not small at all. I stayed in the office long after sunset, taking notes the way other people prayed. By midnight, one truth had begun to emerge. Somebody inside Whitmore Industrial was siphoning money through falsified emergency orders. I wish I could say I immediately suspected my father, because that would make me look sharp and fearless. I did not. At first I thought it had to be Grant. He had pushed hard for agile authorization pathways after a flood response contract the prior year. He loved fast systems, vague controls, and impressive language. It sounded like him. It felt like him. Then I found the approvals. Grant's name appeared on some of the internal memos, but not on the final release authorizations. Those belonged to the executive office. Specifically, they belonged to my father's direct authority chain. I leaned back from my desk and read the names again. Chief Executive Release, Executive Contingency Exception, Legacy Partner Override. All him. My first instinct was denial. Not moral denial, strategic denial. If my father was involved, then this was not simple theft. This was engineered, protected, layered, which meant if I moved too early, evidence could vanish, people could close ranks, and I would become exactly what they always wanted me to be, the emotional daughter making accusations, because she could not handle being overlooked. So I did what they had trained me to do. I stayed quiet. For 2 weeks, I said nothing to anyone outside a narrow circle I could trust. Dana in procurement, Luis in internal compliance, who had once told me loyalty without ethics was just cowardice in a better suit, and Marianne Holt, our former controller, who had officially retired the previous spring, but still understood the company's financial architecture better than any person alive. Marianne did not even let me finish explaining before she asked the right question. Who benefits from the vendors being fragmented? Whoever wants the totals buried, I said. No, she replied. Whoever wants the board to see strong earnings while cash quietly leaves through channels that can later be blamed on emergency volatility. That silenced me. Because that sounded less like theft and more like preparation. Preparation for what? The answer came sooner than I wanted. 3 days later, my father called a family meeting at his house. He did not do that unless he wanted an audience. The dining room looked staged, all dark wood, polished silver, and the oil portrait of my grandfather staring down like a witness who had made one terrible mistake by dying too early. Grant sat at the right side of the table in a navy jacket with no tie, leaning back like he already knew the script. My mother had the careful brightness she wore when she planned to say something cruel and call it practical. My father folded his hands. I have decided it is time to discuss succession. My spoon stopped halfway to my plate. He looked at Grant first, then at me, then back to Grant. Theater. Whitmore Industrial needs decisive continuity. Investors are nervous across the sector. Markets respect clarity. I intend to recommend Grant as president at the next board review with full transition authority over the next fiscal cycle. My mother smiled as if something holy had just occurred. Grant looked down, performing humility with insulting skill. I set my spoon down carefully. You are announcing this now. I am informing family before formal channels, my father said. I thought that courtesy was appropriate. Courtesy would have been asking the person who has been cleaning up your operations for 7 years whether she planned to stay after being publicly passed over. He gave me the look he always used when he wanted to flatten me without raising his voice. This is exactly why you are not ready. There it was. Not your timing, not your evidence, not your record. You. Grant shifted in his seat. Savannah, nobody is saying you are not valuable. I laughed once, short and sharp. That might be the first honest thing anyone has said here. Because valuable is not the same as trusted, is it? My mother cut in. Must you make every family discussion sound like litigation? No, I said. Only the ones that already feel like a verdict. My father did not blink. You have always mistaken diligence for leadership. Running a company is not just catching errors and managing crises, it is vision. I held his gaze, interesting choice of word. He frowned slightly, small but real. I had landed closer than he liked. The conversation ended the way these things always ended. My mother blamed my tone. Grant acted wounded. My father dismissed me with a polished finality that somehow felt more insulting than shouting. On the drive home, I pulled over twice because my hands would not stop shaking. Not because he had chosen Grant, because now I knew why. If Grant took over publicly while the cash leak remained hidden, my father could stage a graceful handoff, protect his image, preserve control through loyalty, and leave any coming instability at his son's feet. If regulators, creditors, or auditors started asking questions later, the story would write itself. Young successor, growing pains, market stress, execution mistakes. Grant was not the heir, he was the shield, and I was supposed to be the quiet daughter who watched it happen. The next morning, I went back through the financials with a different question, not who stole the money, but where pressure was building. By noon, I found a line of credit adjustment tied to collateral realignment. By afternoon, I uncovered personal real estate transfers into a holding company linked through a trust name I recognized from one of my father's golf partners. By evening, I had enough to see the shape of it. Assets were being moved. Debt exposure was being disguised. Emergency vendor fraud was only one branch of something larger. This was not just embezzlement. It was asset shielding before impact. The next week, my father began excluding me from executive meetings I had always attended. My access to certain approval logs suddenly glitched. An assistant I liked could not meet my eyes when she told me new routing procedures now required executive review before archival release. They knew somebody was looking. Then came the insult that pushed everything from suspicion into decision. At a senior leadership reception for a hospital infrastructure contract, my father introduced Grant to a room full of partners as the future of Whitmore. When one board member, Elliot Pierce, asked where I fit into the succession plan, my father smiled and said Savannah is excellent where empathy is needed. She keeps morale intact. Morale. As if I were a floral arrangement with a graduate degree. I smiled through the rest of the evening, thanked the caterer on my way out, got into my car, and cried so hard I had to press my forehead against the steering wheel. Not because I still needed his approval. That part of me had been dying for years. I cried because humiliation is exhausting when it becomes family tradition. Then I wiped my face, started the engine, and called Marianne. I am done waiting, I said. Her voice stayed calm. Good. Then do this correctly. What does correctly look like? It looks like proof nobody can dismiss as daughter drama. It looks like timing. And it looks like understanding that once this starts, you do not get your old family back. I looked through the windshield at the parking lot lights reflecting on wet pavement. I do not think I ever had one. There was silence on the line. Then Marianne said, "Then let us protect what is left." We met that Saturday in the back room of a quiet law office owned by Marianne's niece, Felicity Rowan, a corporate attorney with sharp eyes and no patience for vanity. I brought transaction records, vendor link charts, copied authorizations, and my notes on the succession timeline. Marianne brought 3 years of reconstructed patterns from archived earnings statements and debt movements. Felicity listened without interrupting. When we finished, she closed the folder slowly. "This is serious," she said. "If these documents are authentic, your father may be using company funds and false procurement channels to disguise asset transfers and manipulate board reporting. If he is moving liabilities off appearance while naming your brother's successor, he may also be setting up a governance fraud scenario." I let that settle. Marianne asked, "Can the board be approached directly?" Felicity nodded once. "Yes, but not yet. You need a tighter chain, and you need to assume there is at least one loyalist inside the current board structure who will warn him." She looked at me. "If you do this, Savannah, you cannot do it halfway. He will come after your credibility first, then your access, then your motives. He will say you are bitter, unstable, emotional, jealous, and destructive. Your brother may join him." I thought of Grant at the dining room table, lowering his eyes at the exact moment my future was being erased. "He already has." Felicity slid a legal pad toward me. "Then we build a sequence. Quietly. Carefully. And when the board meeting starts, we make sure the truth is already in the room before he realizes he is the one being reviewed." I stared at the pad, at the first blank line, at the neat shadow my hand cast across it. For years, my father had told everyone I could not lead because I cared too much, noticed too much, remembered too much. He was about to learn that those were not weaknesses. They were evidence. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to use them. The plan began with silence. Not fearful silence, not wounded silence, strategic silence. That was the first thing Felicity drilled into me. Truth did not win merely because it was true. Truth won when it arrived with sequence corroboration and nowhere for liars to hide. So while my father continued grooming Grant in public, I became almost unnervingly agreeable. I stopped pushing back in meetings. I let 2 minor decisions go without challenge, even when I knew they were inefficient. At a Monday executive check-in, I complimented a revised logistics dashboard Grant had barely understood and absolutely had not designed. I laughed once at one of my father's stale jokes about operational perfectionists. I made myself smaller on purpose. It worked. People relax fastest around the woman they think has finally accepted her place. Within a week, access started reopening in subtle ways. Not enough to make me suspicious again, just enough because they no longer believed I was dangerous. They were wrong. Felicity had set up a formal evidence protocol out of her office. Every document was copied, logged, dated, and mapped to a source chain. Marianne reconstructed historical cash flow distortions using old compliance exports and archived budgeting worksheets. Luis from internal compliance did something brave enough that I never forgot it. He quietly flagged prior exceptions that had been closed without complete review and cross-referenced them against executive intervention notes. The overlap was ugly. Emergency procurement exceptions were not random. They clustered around quarter-end reporting periods, especially before board performance reviews and lender briefings. Funds moved out through shell vendors. Meanwhile, headline earnings were protected through timing maneuvers, delayed disclosures, and reclassified liabilities. "Your father is not stealing carelessly," Marianne said one evening, her reading glasses low on her nose as we sat surrounded by printed schedules and takeout containers. "He is staging appearance. That is a different level of danger." "How much?" I asked. She tapped her pencil on a legal pad. "Direct suspicious outflow that we can substantiate already. Enough to trigger panic. Broader manipulated exposure if we include disguised liabilities and hidden related party transfers catastrophic." I exhaled slowly. "And Grant?" She looked at me with a levelness that hurt. "Complicit is not the same as informed." That question haunted me more than the rest. Was Grant in on it? At first, all I had was circumstantial evidence. He had championed the faster approval pathways. He had attended several strategy sessions around vendor restructuring. He had personally introduced one outside consultant whose recommendations somehow aligned with the procurement loopholes later exploited. But whether he knew the full architecture or was simply enjoying the privileges handed to him remained unclear. A week later, I got my answer. I was leaving the executive floor late one evening when I realized I had forgotten my phone charger in the small conference room near my father's office. The hallway lights had dimmed to night settings and the floor was mostly empty. As I approached, I heard voices through the half-closed door. "Grant." And my father. I froze. "I am telling you," Grant said, his voice low and frayed. "If the board asks about the margin compression in service contracts, I need a cleaner explanation than temporary volatility." My father's answer came calm and contemptuous. "Then give them confidence. That is why you are there." "That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters until transition is complete." There was a pause. Then Grant said something that changed everything. "What if Savannah has noticed?" I did not breathe. My father let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "Savannah notices everything. That has always been her problem." "So you think she knows?" "I think she suspects she has found a puzzle. She has no idea how large the room is." My chest tightened so hard I could feel my pulse behind my eyes. Grant spoke again, lower now. "You said this was temporary. You said once the real estate protection was complete and the debt was rolled, the rest would normalize." "It will. And if it does not?" My father's tone hardened. "Then you will be president, and your job will be to steady the board while I handle legacy matters privately." There it was. Grant was not merely the golden son. He knew enough to be afraid. He also knew enough to stay seated. I stepped backward without sound, walked to the elevator, and did not let myself react until the doors closed. Then I leaned against the mirrored wall and closed my eyes. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another thing to learn your family had discussed your intelligence like a maintenance issue. When I told Felicity and Marianne what I had heard, neither interrupted. Felicity wrote down exact phrases. "Legacy matters privately," she repeated. "That is useful." "Grant is not innocent," I said. "No," Felicity replied. "But he may still be weak." I looked at her. "That sounds like mercy." "It is not mercy, it is leverage." The first major turning point came through someone I had not expected. Elliot Pierce, one of the independent board members, had always struck me as careful in the way people become when they have spent years surviving other men's egos. He was older, measured, financially conservative, and not particularly warm. I had never thought of him as an ally. At most, I thought of him as a man with functional hearing in a room full of applause. Felicity suggested we test him. Not with accusation, with anomaly. A packet was delivered to Elliot's private office through a secure courier. No cover letter, no drama, just 3 reconciled schedules showing discrepancies between emergency procurement disbursements, quarter-end earnings presentations, and collateral movement summaries. Enough to signal danger, not enough to expose our full hand. The next afternoon, Elliot requested an unscheduled audit committee pre-read for the upcoming board meeting. That was the first time I knew the ground beneath my father was beginning to shift. He tried to mask it, of course. At executive check-in the next morning, he seemed relaxed, almost buoyant. He praised Grant's market-facing initiatives. He asked me a pointless question about freight compression, as if inviting me back into usefulness. But he kept tapping one finger against his pen, a small staccato betrayal I had only ever seen when lenders pushed him harder than expected. He knew some thread had been pulled. He did not know by whom. That evening, he called me directly. "Dinner tomorrow," he said. Not asked, said. "I have plans." "Cancel them." I almost laughed. Instead, I answered, "What for?" There was the slightest pause. "We should clear the air before the board review. I would prefer family unity." Family unity. The phrase landed like a bruise. I went anyway. Not because I trusted him, because I wanted to see what version of truth he was preparing. He chose a private dining room at a downtown steakhouse, one of those old places where power dressed itself in dark paneling and expensive silence. He was already seated when I arrived, jacket-buttoned, expression mild. For 10 full minutes, he talked about nothing important. Industry conditions, insurance costs, a retired supplier in Michigan. Then finally he folded his napkin beside his plate and looked at me like a man about to explain weather to a child. "You have seemed unsettled lately." I held his gaze. "Have I?" "You must understand that disappointment can distort perception." There it was. He had decided on his script: unstable daughter, emotional reaction, bruised ambition. "I am not disappointed," I said. "I am interested." "In what?" "In why you rushed succession before year-end review. In why emergency vendor patterns spike around board reporting. In why liabilities seem to move when collateral does." His face did not change much, but some vital warmth left it. "You are out of your depth." "That is one interpretation." He leaned back. "Savannah, let me save you from a mistake. Businesses at our level require structuring decisions that are not always legible from the middle tiers." "I do not work in the middle tiers." "No," he said softly. "You work near them. That is not the same thing." I realized then that he still believed hierarchy itself could erase facts. He truly thought authority determined reality. "What exactly are you warning me against?" I asked. He reached for his water, took a careful sip, and set the glass down. "Against confusing partial information with misconduct. Against embarrassing your family over matters you do not fully understand. Against aligning yourself with people whose interests may not include your well-being." That last part was for Felicity, though he did not name her, which meant he knew or suspected legal consultation. "Good." I leaned forward. "And what are you warning Grant against?" A shadow crossed his expression, brief, real. "You should not pit yourself against your brother. He will be running this company soon." I smiled without warmth. "Then he should probably learn what you have done to it." He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a small, disappointed shake of the head, the same gesture he used when I was 12 and refused to apologize for something Grant started. "I had hoped," he said, "that by now you would understand the difference between family and ego." The cruelty of that line was almost elegant. I stood. "No," I said quietly, "I understand it better than you do." He did not stop me when I left. That night, Felicity accelerated everything. "Your father just confirmed 2 things," she said. "First, he knows risk is active. Second, he believes he can still frame you before formal review. We move now." The next 72 hours blurred into controlled fire. Marianne finished a master summary tying suspicious disbursements to executive override authority and downstream shell entities. Luis secured metadata proving certain archived approvals had been altered after submission. Dana obtained internal message exports showing procurement staff had questioned vendor validity and were overridden from above. And then, unexpectedly, a final piece arrived from outside. A former Treasury analyst named Priya sent an email to a secure address Felicity had provided. She had left Whitmore Industrial 8 months earlier after what she called persistent pressure to stop asking timing questions. Attached were copied notes from a lender prep session in which my father instructed finance staff to keep transitional debt posture separate from materials prepared for broader board distribution. The wording was vague enough to sound technical. Combined with everything else, it was devastating. We now had motive, method, timing, concealment, and corroboration. What we needed was a stage. The board meeting had originally been scheduled as a standard year-end governance review, with succession discussion folded into the second half. Elliot Pierce, using his audit committee authority, altered the agenda 48 hours before the meeting. A financial controls update was added before succession review. My father objected, of course. Too late. The morning of the meeting, I dressed like a woman attending her own execution and planning to survive it. Black suit, cream silk blouse. No jewelry except my grandmother's watch, the one my mother once called too severe for a young woman. I wore it anyway. As I stood in front of the mirror, I thought about every smaller version of myself that had sat quietly while the men in my family decided what I was fit for. Pleasant but not forceful. Capable but not commanding. Useful but not central. Too observant. Too emotional. Too difficult. I looked at my reflection and understood something simple and liberating. They had been wrong in so many repetitive ways that it had almost become boring. The boardroom on the top floor had walls of glass on two sides and framed portraits of former company leaders on the other. Men, all of them. My grandfather, his predecessor, my father in a younger photograph from his first decade as chief executive, looking almost handsome in the ruthless way success can sometimes mimic virtue. Directors filtered in one by one. Elliot Pierce reserved and unreadable. Helen Duarte sharp and efficient chair of governance. Martin Kessler, whose loyalty tended to follow stability. Two outside advisors. Corporate counsel. Grant arrived last among the executives, pale under his confidence. My father followed 30 seconds later, speaking to the board secretary with the ease of a man who still believed the room belonged to him. He nodded at me once. I nodded back. The meeting opened normally enough. Minutes approved. Quarterly summaries referenced. Then Elliot cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Before we moved to succession, he said the audit committee has requested review of certain control irregularities and reporting concerns requiring immediate discussion. My father turned slowly toward him. I was not informed of any confirmed irregularities. That is because confirmation, Elliot said, is what we are here to determine. A folder was placed before each director. Not by my father's office, by corporate counsel. The shift in air was instant, not loud, just irreversible. My father did not reach for the folder immediately. He looked at me first. That was when he knew. Not everything, not how much, but enough. Helen Duarte opened the packet and began reading. Martin Kessler flipped to the summary schedules, frowned, then turned back to the opening memo. Grant's hand moved toward his water glass and stopped halfway. Elliot spoke again. These materials indicate potential misuse of emergency procurement exceptions, incomplete disclosure of related liabilities, and possible concealment of executive-level override activity. Given the seriousness of the matter, I am asking Ms. Whitmore to walk the board through the initial findings. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then I placed both hands on the table, rose to my feet, and looked directly at the people my father had spent years teaching to overlook me. "Thank you," I said. My voice did not shake. Across from me, my father's face hardened into something colder than anger. The board meeting had started, and for the first time in our family's history, I was not there to endure it. I was there to take the room. The room was silent in the way only powerful rooms can be silent. Not the casual quiet of people waiting for coffee. This was the quiet of men and women recalculating the shape of authority. I remained standing at the end of the table while the directors flipped through the opening pages of the packet Elliot had distributed. The paper itself was unremarkable. White. Corporate letterhead. Simple charts. But the numbers inside it carried weight, and everyone in that room understood it. Across from me, my father had not yet touched his folder. Grant had. His eyes moved across the first page quickly, then more slowly. The color drained from his face in a way he tried very hard to disguise. He had always believed he could improvise through anything. The problem with documented truth was that it did not negotiate. Elliot Pierce looked up at me. "Ms. Whitmore," he said calmly, "please begin." I placed my palm on the first page of my copy. 3 quarters ago, I said a series of emergency procurement exceptions began appearing in our operating divisions. These exceptions bypass standard vendor validation procedures in order to accelerate infrastructure response during municipal emergencies. Helen Duarte nodded slightly. "Standard disaster protocol." "Yes," I said, "but these were not disasters." A slide appeared on the screen behind me. I had rehearsed this moment only once with Felicity, and even then she told me not to memorize words. Memorized speeches collapse when someone interrupts. Truth survives interruption. The slide displayed a series of dates. Each of these exceptions occurred within 2 weeks of quarterly earnings reports. I continued. Each was routed through a newly created vendor profile approved under Executive Contingency Authority. Martin Kessler leaned forward. Are you suggesting the vendors were not legitimate? I am suggesting I said evenly that they do not exist. That sentence landed like a dropped weight. My father finally opened his folder. He flipped through the pages with controlled precision, the same way he always reviewed contract drafts before signing them. He was reading fast, not for content, for exposure. The next slide appeared. Shell vendor structures, payment routes, account transfers, funds from Whitmore Industrial. I said were routed through these vendors and then transferred to a holding structure connected to 3 separate limited liability companies. Helen looked up. Owned by whom? I let the silence stretch one breath longer than comfortable. By entities linked to the Whitmore Legacy Property Trust. Every head in the room turned toward my father. He did not flinch. That trust protects family real estate, he said calmly. It has nothing to do with operating capital. Except I replied when operating capital is used to fund it. Grant looked at him sharply. My father finally turned to me. You are presenting speculation, he said. I expected that. What I am presenting, I said, are transaction paths confirmed by internal records, archived payment metadata, and banking verification logs. Another slide appeared. Luis had done brilliant work reconstructing the data chains. Every transfer, every override code, every timestamp. The room became very still. Helen Duarte spoke again, this time slower. Executive contingency authorization appears here repeatedly. Yes. And that authorization chain leads to the chief executive office. Yes. And the chief executive office, she said carefully, is currently Mr. Whitmore. My father folded his hands. I authorized emergency response funding. If vendors misrepresented themselves, that is a compliance failure, not executive misconduct. That defense might have worked if the pattern had been smaller. But Marianne had built the timeline too carefully. I moved to the next slide. This one showed collateral realignment filings, debt movement, property transfers. And yet, I said quietly, those same vendor payments coincide with asset transfers into the trust structure. Grant pushed his chair back slightly. What are you saying? He asked. I looked directly at him. I am saying that operating funds were quietly diverted while liabilities were shifted away from visible reporting. The words sat in the air. Martin Kessler exhaled slowly. Jesus. My father's voice remained level. This presentation ignores market strategy. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Market strategy? Yes, my father said. Asset protection during sector volatility. That would require disclosure to the board, Helen replied. Not if the transfers are temporary. Temporary transfers of corporate funds, she said, into private structures. Grant's chair creaked as he leaned forward. You told me this was internal restructuring, he said to my father. My father did not answer immediately. He simply looked at him. In that moment, I realized something strange. My father was not afraid yet. He was calculating. He believed he could still control the narrative. So I delivered the next piece. 3 employees raised questions about the vendor structure, I said. Their concerns were overridden through executive instruction. Dana's procurement email appeared on the screen, then Luis's compliance notes, then the metadata alteration logs. Helen's voice sharpened. These approval records were modified. Yes. When? After submission. And by whom? The slide answered for me. Executive office credentials. For the first time, my father's jaw tightened. The boardroom temperature seemed to drop. Grant stared at the screen. You changed the approvals, he said. My father finally spoke. This is a distortion. It is a record, I said. He turned to the board. My daughter has spent years resenting succession decisions. She has assembled fragments of operational complexity and woven them into a story. I expected that too. It was the easiest defense available. Personal motive. Emotional instability. I nodded once. Yes, I said calmly. That argument would be persuasive if the evidence came only from me. Another folder slid across the table. Felicity Rowan stood near the back wall beside corporate counsel. This packet, she said, contains corroborating analysis prepared by external financial review. The room shifted again. External review changed everything. My father looked at her. You are not authorized to present in this meeting. Helen Duarte spoke before Felicity could answer. I invited her. Grant stared at the table. For the first time since the meeting began, my father looked genuinely surprised. Elliot Pierce cleared his throat. The audit committee requested independent verification after receiving preliminary materials. My father's eyes moved back to me. You planned this. I held his gaze. You taught me to prepare. The directors began reading the second packet. This one included the lender preparation notes Priya had sent. That was the moment the room changed. Because those notes showed intent. Transitional debt posture, Martin read aloud. Helen looked up slowly. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Were you preparing to transfer liabilities to the incoming president? Grant went completely still. My father's voice remained smooth. The company required structural flexibility. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters. The arrogance in that sentence finally cracked the room. Grant stood abruptly. You said this would stabilize before transition, he said. My father's eyes flicked toward him. Sit down. Number. For the first time in our lives, my brother looked frightened. Were you planning to leave me holding this? My father's patience snapped. You were going to run the company. That is not the same thing. The board members exchanged looks. Everything that had been theory 5 minutes earlier was becoming personal. Helen closed the packet. We are suspending the succession discussion immediately. Silence followed. My father leaned back slowly in his chair. You cannot seriously be considering. We are considering, Elliot interrupted, whether executive authority has been abused. My father looked around the table. For 30 years he had ruled rooms like this. Now the balance had shifted, but he still believed he could win. You are being manipulated, he said to them. No, Helen replied. She looked directly at me. We are being informed. The first battle of that board meeting had ended, and my father had just realized he was no longer controlling the agenda. But the war inside the company was far from over. Because the next part of the fight would not happen in that room. It would happen through alliances. And alliances, I would soon learn, were far more dangerous than enemies. Victory in a boardroom does not end a war. It only exposes where the war actually lives. Within hours of the meeting adjournment, Whitmore Industrial divided itself into quiet camps. Not officially. Corporations rarely fracture out loud. But conversations changed tone. People chose which offices they entered carefully. Email responses slowed. Doors closed more often. The board had not removed my father yet. They had opened an investigation, temporarily restricted certain executive authorizations, and assigned an external audit team to review financial pathways. Officially, he remained chief executive. Unofficially, the ground beneath him had begun to crack, and that made him dangerous. The first thing Felicity warned me about was retaliation. When someone loses control, she said, they stop following the same rules that kept them powerful. She was right. 2 days after the board meeting, my system access to procurement archives disappeared. An hour later, my assistant informed me that several division managers had been instructed to route operational updates through Grant's office instead of mine. That afternoon, an internal message circulated suggesting that unauthorized financial interpretations had been presented during the board session and would be clarified soon. My father was building a counter-narrative. Discredit the messenger, blur the evidence, delay consequences. Classic containment strategy. So we accelerated ours. Marianne coordinated quietly with the external auditors assigned by the board. Luis began compiling internal policy violations connected to the altered approval records. Dana continued documenting procurement irregularities that were still surfacing. But the most important development came from inside the executive floor. Grant asked to meet me, not in his office, in a cafe 2 blocks away from headquarters. That alone told me how unstable things had become. He arrived early, already sitting with a coffee he had barely touched. His jacket was wrinkled, his hair uncharacteristically disordered. For years I had watched people admire his confidence. Now I was seeing something else. Fear. You could have warned me, he said when I sat down. I studied his face. You knew enough to ask him about it. That was different. How? I thought it was timing adjustments. Liquidity management. Something temporary. You believed that because you wanted to. He rubbed his forehead. You blindsided the board. I presented evidence. You made me look like a fool. That part, I said quietly, was not difficult. He flinched. For a moment I wondered if I had gone too far. Then I remembered the dining room conversation months earlier. Grant leaned back in his chair. What happens now? That depends on the investigation. And you. This is not about me. He laughed bitterly. Everything about this is about you. I shook my head. No, this is about a company our grandfather built and a father who decided it was a tool. Grant stared at the table. Then he said something I had not expected. I will testify. The word surprised me enough that I did not answer immediately. You will what? I will confirm what he told me. About transition, about liability positioning. Why? He met my eyes. Because if I do not, I become the fall guy. Honesty at last. Felicity had predicted this. Weak allies are still allies. Fine, I said. But understand something. This is not a negotiation for power. If you testify, you do it because the truth matters. Grant gave a tired smile. The truth matters now because it protects me. At least he was not pretending. We left the cafe separately. For the first time since the board meeting, I felt something close to cautious momentum. That feeling lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, everything collapsed. The betrayal arrived through someone I had trusted completely. Luis. He had been one of the earliest people helping reconstruct the evidence trail. His compliance notes had exposed the altered approval logs. Without his work, the board presentation would have been weaker, which was why his disappearance felt so strange. At first, it was small things, delayed responses, a canceled meeting, then a message saying he was working remotely for a few days. The next morning, Felicity called me. Her voice was tight. "Savannah," she said, "I need you to come to the office immediately." When I arrived, she handed me a printed document. My stomach dropped as I read the header. Internal Compliance Memorandum, signed by Luis. The document claimed that the procurement discrepancies were the result of data interpretation errors and misunderstood authorization layering. It also implied that my presentation to the board had exaggerated the issue. For several seconds, I could not speak. "That is not possible," I said finally. "It is happening," Felicity replied. My hands trembled. "He helped build the evidence." "Yes." "Why would he?" The answer hit me before she said it. My father. Luis had been pressured, or bought, or threatened. It did not matter which. The damage was immediate. Within hours, the memorandum circulated among senior leadership and several board advisors. The narrative began shifting again. Was the situation really fraud, or merely procedural confusion? Had the presentation been premature? Had Savannah Whitmore overreached? The investigation slowed, and worse, Grant panicked. He called me that evening. "This is getting out of control," he said. "Because one document appeared, because it makes the whole case look unstable." It does not. It does if the compliance officer says the evidence was misinterpreted. "So now you believe him?" "I believe the board will hesitate." His voice had changed. The fragile alliance we built at the cafe was already cracking. "You said you would testify," I reminded him. "I said I would confirm what I heard. And I do not know if I should step into a legal war between you and Dad." There it was. The golden sun retreating. "You are already in it," I said. "Maybe," he replied quietly, "but maybe the smarter move is stepping back." The line went silent. For a moment, I simply held the phone. Then I said, "You are doing exactly what he expects." He did not deny it. After the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment staring at the skyline outside the window. For the first time since the board meeting, doubt crept in. Luis had reversed his statement. Grant was retreating. My father was regaining narrative control. And the board was waiting for certainty. Felicity joined me later that night with Marianne. We spread the documents across my dining table again. The same numbers, the same records, but the atmosphere had changed. "Your father struck back faster than expected," Marianne said. "And Luis gave him ammunition," Felicity added. I rubbed my temples. "Without Luis, the metadata chain looks weaker." "Yes," Felicity said. "And Grant will not hold his ground." Number. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Marianne leaned forward. "Your father thinks he broke your alliance network." "He did." "No," she said quietly. "He exposed it." I looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means now we know exactly where the weak points were." Felicity nodded slowly. "And weak points," she said, "can be replaced." I frowned. "With what?" She slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a business card. The name printed on it made my pulse jump. "Former federal financial investigator, Marcus Halpern. He contacted the audit team this afternoon," Felicity said. "And he believes the case may involve something larger than internal fraud." My exhaustion vanished instantly. "What does he want?" "To meet you." The war inside Whitmore Industrial had just entered a new phase, and this time we would not be fighting alone. The night after Felicity showed me Marcus Halpern's card, I barely slept. Not because I doubted the evidence anymore. The numbers had stopped being numbers weeks earlier. They had become a map of choices my father made deliberately, methodically, and without hesitation. What kept me awake was something else. For the first time since the board meeting, we had someone entering the fight who was not connected to Whitmore Industrial at all. That meant two things. He could not be intimidated by family loyalty, and he could not be easily dismissed. The meeting took place the following afternoon in Felicity's office conference room. Marcus Halpern arrived exactly on time. He was older than I expected, with gray hair, narrow eyes, and the kind of calm posture that suggested he had spent years watching people lie under fluorescent lights. He did not shake my hand immediately. He looked at me first. "You are Savannah Whitmore." "Yes." "The daughter." "Yes." "The one who started this." I nodded. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Good," he said. "Then we should begin with honesty." Felicity slid the folders across the table. Marcus read everything without speaking. Page after page. Transaction paths. Authorization codes. The altered metadata records Luis had once helped confirm. The lender preparation notes Priya had provided. Nearly 40 minutes passed before he closed the final folder. "This is not small," he said. Marianne leaned forward. "That is what we told the board." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You told the board about internal misuse. And this is larger." The room fell silent. He tapped one page with his finger. "These shell vendors are structured with interstate routing. Some of the accounts receiving funds appear in two other investigations involving infrastructure procurement fraud. My pulse jumped. You are saying the money left the company. I am saying the money did not stop where you think it did. Felicity sat up straighter. Are you suggesting criminal exposure? Marcus looked at her calmly. I am suggesting federal exposure. The words hung in the room like a sudden storm. For years, Whitmore Industrial had been a respected contractor for municipal systems across multiple states. Federal investigation would not merely threaten leadership, it would threaten the entire company. Can you prove it? I asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened his briefcase and removed a thin tablet. These transfers from your procurement accounts, he said, pointing at the screen, flowed into holding structures linked to infrastructure subcontracting groups under investigation for bid manipulation. My throat tightened. So my father was not just protecting assets. Marcus met my eyes. No, it appears he was feeding a network. Marianne whispered one word. God. Marcus turned the tablet toward me. If these connections are confirmed, the investigation will expand quickly. Which means the board will move faster, Felicity said. Yes. I leaned back slowly. For weeks, the fight had been about corporate misconduct. Now it was about something far more dangerous. Marcus continued. I will testify if necessary. But you should understand something. Once federal authorities step in, you will lose control of the timeline. I thought about that carefully. For most of my life, I had watched my father control every timeline in the company. Every decision. Every narrative. Maybe it was time someone else controlled it. When do we move? I asked. Marcus looked at Felicity. Immediately. Within 48 hours, the external audit team received Marcus's analysis. The board received a confidential briefing connecting Whitmore Industrial's financial irregularities to ongoing procurement investigations. And something remarkable happened. The hesitation disappeared. Helen Duarte called an emergency board session. Not a review. A decision. The meeting took place 3 mornings later. This time, the atmosphere inside the boardroom felt entirely different. No one pretended the issue was procedural confusion anymore. Directors spoke quietly with legal counsel before the meeting began. The external audit team had 3 representatives present. Marcus sat beside Felicity near the far wall. Grant arrived early again, but this time he did not sit beside my father. He chose a seat halfway down the table. My father entered last. The moment he saw Marcus Halpern in the room, something in his expression finally changed. Recognition, not fear. But calculation turning into inevitability. Helen Duarte began the meeting. Mr. Whitmore, she said calmly, new evidence has emerged connecting company funds to external procurement fraud investigations. My father did not sit down. That is absurd. Marcus spoke from the back of the room. No, it is documented. Every eye turned toward him. Marcus stood slowly. I spent 15 years investigating infrastructure contract fraud, he said. These shell vendor structures appear repeatedly in ongoing federal cases. My father stared at him. You are not authorized to participate in this meeting. Helen answered before Marcus could. I authorized him. The power balance inside the room had shifted completely now. Marcus stepped forward and placed a printed report on the table. Transaction routing from Whitmore Industrial procurement accounts intersects with 3 entities currently under federal review. Grant whispered something under his breath. My father's composure began cracking. You have no proof that funds were not legitimate subcontracting arrangements. Marcus looked directly at him. I have proof that the subcontractors do not exist. Silence. Helen folded her hands. Mr. Whitmore, until this matter is resolved, the board is placing you on administrative leave effective immediately. The words landed like thunder. For 30 years, my father had ruled Whitmore Industrial. Now the board had removed him. He looked around the room slowly. At the directors. At Grant. At me. You believe this, he said quietly. No one answered, because the evidence had already answered. He picked up his folder, closed it calmly, and walked out of the boardroom without another word. For the first time in my life, the man who had always controlled every room left one in silence. And the investigation had only just begun. The collapse of my father's power happened faster than anyone expected. Once the board removed him from operational control, the investigation accelerated with ruthless efficiency. Federal investigators contacted the company within days. Marcus had been right. Whitmore Industrial's financial pathways intersected with a broader procurement fraud network, stretching across multiple states. Shell vendors had been used to manipulate infrastructure contracts, redirect funds, and influence bidding structures. My father had not simply diverted money. He had participated in a system designed to exploit public infrastructure spending. The consequences were immediate. Banking partners froze certain accounts pending review. Several contracts were temporarily suspended. Federal investigators interviewed multiple executives, including Grant. Grant cooperated quickly. Fear can make honesty appear suddenly attractive. Within weeks, the evidence chain became undeniable. Transaction records approval overrides, shell company structures, and communications tied the financial manipulation directly to executive authority. My father resigned before formal charges were announced, but resignation did not stop the investigation. 6 months later, he faced federal fraud charges tied to procurement manipulation and financial misrepresentation. For a man who had spent decades presenting himself as untouchable, the fall was astonishingly ordinary. No dramatic courtroom speech, no public redemption, just quiet legal consequences. Grant survived the investigation, but not his reputation. The board allowed him to remain temporarily during the transition, but leadership confidence never returned. Within a year, he left the company entirely. Our family never truly recovered. My mother stopped calling me. She believed loyalty should have meant silence. But silence would have meant destroying the company our grandfather built. Whitmore Industrial itself did survive, barely at first. The board appointed interim leadership while restructuring governance policies and financial oversight systems. Independent compliance controls replaced the executive override pathways my father had used. And eventually the board asked me a question I had waited years to hear. Will you lead the company? I did not answer immediately. Power had once been the thing I thought I wanted most. But after everything that happened, I understood something more important. Leadership was not about proving someone wrong. It was about protecting what should never have been endangered in the first place. So I accepted, not as revenge, as responsibility. The company slowly stabilized. Employees who had been afraid to speak before began sharing concerns openly. Compliance systems strengthened, contracts returned gradually. Whitmore Industrial was smaller than before, but it was honest again. And in many ways, honesty made it stronger. The strangest part of the entire experience was realizing that family is not always the people who share your name. Sometimes family is the people who stand beside you when telling the truth becomes dangerous. Felicity, Marianne, Dana, Marcus, even Elliot Pierce. They had chosen integrity over comfort, and that choice saved an entire company. Today, when I walk into the same boardroom where everything began, the portraits on the wall still look the same. But the room feels different, because authority no longer belongs to the loudest voice in it. It belongs to the truth. And sometimes truth begins with a daughter who refuses to stay silent. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone in your own family betrayed your trust or underestimated what you were capable of? What did you do? Did karma ever come back around? Share your experience in the comments, because stories like this remind us we are not alone in moments when standing up feels impossible. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that truth and justice still matter. Thank you for listening to my story. And wherever you are watching from, I hope your life is surrounded by people who value honesty more than power.